and welcome to another episode of The Bike Shed, a podcast from your friends at thoughtbot about developing great software. I'm Joël Quenneville.
And I'm Sally And together we're here to share a bit of what we've learned along the way.
So Sally, what's new in your world?
Oh, many things are new in my world. My kids graduated high school last week. I have twins, and they graduated high school and getting ready for college, and it's a wild time. It's kind of exhausting, but it's also pretty exciting.
It's a big milestone.
It is. I feel like, it's been something we've been looking at for 18 plus years. And I realized the other day, I was talking to my wife about something and was like, we could just deal with that after the kids leave for college, which used to be a way in the future thing. And now it's a 8 weeks from now thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that mean they are moving out?
They are. They're both going to colleges fairly close by. Well, one's about 25 minutes away and the other one's about an hour away. But they'll both be living on campus, moving out, living with roommates, the whole thing.
Well, that changes the dynamic at home for you as well.
It certainly does. It's going to be a lot quieter here.
Get a whole new room to take over for your knitting projects.
I'm going to try not to totally invade their spaces until they've finished college and are real adults, but we'll see.
Uh-huh. They get this sort of transitional period.
Yeah.
You get to come home and your bedroom's still there.
Yeah, you should have a place to sleep at Christmas, I think.
Uh-huh.
So what's new in your world?
I went hiking recently, climbed a mountain.
Cool.
And it's one of those mountains where you end up doing a lot of scrambling. So you're sort of walking through a boulder field and you're sort of picking your way through rocks. They're oftentimes over rocks. You might have points where it's more or less just a big slab of granite that you're kind of walking over, especially as you reach towards the top of the mountain. That's a really fun way to hike, I find. A little bit of a technical challenge makes it interesting. And I found that was just a really fun time.
That sounds fun. It also sounds like something I would injure myself doing. Did you come out safely?
I did, yes.
Yeah, it's nice. I am intensely clumsy, and there's no way I would get through that without at least one injury, but hopefully it'd be minor enough that it'd be worth going again.
I know for some of that, poles can be really helpful. I know a lot of people use poles. Honestly, I find it much harder coming down.
My brain jumps to, cool, I would stab myself with that, but...
You'd still injure yourself with poles, you said?
Oh, I think I would stab myself with the poles accidentally.
Oh.
Yeah, but yeah.
I guess they are dangerous in that way.
Yeah. I'll be fine. We're actually going to Yellowstone next week, and we'll be doing some hiking, so hopefully
nice.
I escaped that without any major injuries too. Where were you hiking? Nearby, or?
This was Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire.
Cool. I bet that was beautiful.
It's apparently one of the most hiked mountains in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
Not a mountain you hear about, but it is just enough of a challenge and close enough to some large metro areas and very accessible. And so people show up there and hike the mountain.
That sounds really fun.
So there's a difference between just sort of hiking to enjoy the trail and sort of hiking to try to reach a mountain.
Yeah.
And people sometimes compare career progression with climbing a mountain, working your way up through a variety of titles, getting ever fancier and fancier titles.
Yeah.
In our industry, it's kind of interesting because you reach a point where you often get pushed into the management track.
Mm-hmm.
Although many organizations also have a sort of specialized IC track where you can get sort of beyond senior while still staying at the individual contributor type role where you don't have people reporting to you.
Yeah, and that's something we introduced a few years ago at thoughtbot, right?
That's right. So thoughtbot has a sort of regular developer role, a senior developer, and then our sort of senior plus role is called principal developer.
Yeah, and it's been interesting sort of seeing us as an organization grapple with what that means, especially in a consulting company, because it's kind of different than it would be in a product company.
Yeah, although honestly, even within a product company, there are a lot of different ways to interpret that role.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's a little bit of hand waving around what the titles mean.
Yeah.
You often see sort of staff engineer also sort of thrown into the mix. depending on the company, some might sort of merge those two roles together and call it just staff, just call it principal. Some will sort of split them and say you are staff, and then beyond staff, you're principal. So there's a lot of hand waving around what those titles mean in terms of the gradation. And then also in terms of the actual role, what are the ways you're trying to have impact? What they all have in common, though, is that you're looking to have broader impact rather than beyond just writing good code. So you're not just shipping more and better as a single person, but you're also not managing a team. So you're finding some other way of having an impact at a team or organization level that is not management.
Yeah, I think, and this is not a direct comparison, so like the metaphor falls apart pretty quickly. But when I think about it, I sort of think about it in terms of academia, where it's like, if you go and get a PhD, that's not just what you did as an undergrad, but more of it, right? It's sort of a different approach to like, how can I contribute to this field in a meaningful way that I'm interested in? And not just like, I'm going to do harder homework, which seems kind of similar because like a principal, it's not just like, he's the guy who gets the hard tickets. It's like a broader thinking holistically about things and contributing to the company and the field in ways that interest you and like progressing the work. Does that sort of align with how you see it?
Yeah, I would say so. There can be sort of a lot of different ways that you can push on that. I think part of what you were describing sounds a little bit like what I think back in the day used to be termed an architect.
Mm-hmm.
I've not really seen that role much in the past decade, but that often was kind of a senior plus person who was involved a little bit more in thinking broadly about the system as a whole and how to align strategy to engineering.
Yeah. Whenever I think about architect in the term of software engineering, I think of this one guy I worked with decades ago who was an architect, and I could never figure out what he did because it mostly seemed to be wandering around and eating other people's sandwiches. But I'm pretty sure that's not actually what his role is supposed to be.
I think that architects sometimes had a bad reputation in the industry for a little bit. That the like, what exactly would you say you do here?
Mm-hmm.
Or just sort of a little bit too disconnected from the work and sort of pie in the sky thinking about structure. That doesn't mean that sort of work isn't valuable, but yeah, that particular manifestation of it, I think, often had a bad reputation.
Really, I think the role would ideally be more like that higher level thinking, but also sort of a bridge between like the ICs who are not involved in that and the other pieces of the team that maybe aren't even developers. Does that resonate with you, or is that something that you think of as part of your role as principal?
It can be. I think where things are a little bit different internally at thoughtbot is that we're not developing software for ourselves, or at least not in that sort of full-time way that product organizations would.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit less of that aspect of the role for myself internally at thoughtbot. I have occasionally been in a little bit in a role like that for a client, depending if that's what they need.
Mm-hmm.
But oftentimes that's a role in an organization that you want someone who has sort of deeper organizational ties, where they have some of that history of how things are. That often helps them to be more effective in a role like that.
That makes sense. So what does the principal role look like for you?
So there's kind of multifaceted because there are sort of internal versus external aspects. But all of them are grounded in having an impact that is beyond just doing excellent work for clients through coding. So that can be various forms of acting as a multiplier on our team. That can be through various forms of having a broad impact on the industry beyond thoughtbot. And that can also take a few different forms with our clients. But again, the core of it all is impact that is beyond just doing solid technical work, sort of in that day-to-day.
Yeah, which I feel like kind of in my mental academia framework, which I'm not sure why I came up with that. I've never really been in academia. It's sort of like the difference between teaching classes and like the work a professor might do outside of the classroom and research or collaboration or visibility for their area.
One thing that we encourage principal developers to do within thoughtbot is to pick an area of focus, an area where they want to have maybe outsized contributions within the company. And for me, that area is sort of content and teaching, right? Because those are both areas that I find a lot of meaning in. And so that involves a combination of both myself pushing the limits of what I do in that area. So speaking at a lot of conferences, writing blog posts, taking gnarly technical topics and making them really accessible to developers, either internally at thoughtbot or something that's more public. But the flip side of that is the enablement side. And so that is helping other developers at thoughtbot to do the same. And so some of that is maintaining editorial guidelines. I've done some things around supporting coaching people who are interested in speaking at conferences. So the CFP process can be intimidating. What are the ways that we can help people through that?
Yeah. And I think that sort of highlights one of the things that's different about sort of the principal role is that, going from a developer to senior developer is sort of an expected path, right? If you are a developer and you've been working long enough and improving your work and contributing to the company and whatnot, like eventually you will become a senior developer. Whereas principal developer is not something that everybody is going to end up even trying to do, right? Like it doesn't necessarily interest everybody. It's sort of a way to distinguish people who are already really interested in doing that kind of work, right? It's not just like, well, you've been a senior for 5 years and you're so good at it, so let's make you a principal now.
Right. For most of the people at thoughtbot who have been promoted into that role, that's often a sort of recognition of contributions or delivering things at a level that are significantly beyond the expectations of just the senior developer role.
Yeah.
Especially in either sort of pushing the capabilities of what thoughtbot does in a particular direction, or enablement of others. And again, it's that you're doing important things or you're helping other people do things even better than they are right now. And that sort of dual track of it is how a lot of impact that happens that is not management when you're looking beyond just daily shipping code at a high quality.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that sounds like a lot going on, and I know it's a lot going on because I see the work and the efforts and the results from the work of the principals that I've been lucky to interact with. How do you cram all of that into a work week? How do you make time for that? How do you make space for that?
So one thing that's really nice at thoughtbot is we get that investment day Friday. It does involve being very strategic with that time, and part of that does get eaten up by more meetings, because part of what the role tries to do is to help translate strategic goals from company management into actual impacts on the ground. And so that involves then attending those meetings, getting a little bit more of that context of like, here's what we're trying to do, here's how we're thinking about certain problems that are ahead of us, and then finding ways to convert those into more practical things, and sometimes advocating for them within the team. So some of that happens in addition to then, perhaps pitching a talk to a conference or running an internal workshop on how CFPs work, or coaching someone on a project that they're doing. So all of those things kind of stack up pretty quickly.
Yeah. Do you find yourself doing much of that in your off hours? If off hours is even really a concept for you?
I think there's a gradation. Things like doing a conference talk always spill over into my personal time. It's just, my process is very time intensive, and it is partly a work thing, but partly also a thing that I enjoy. And so I don't mind some of that spilling into personal time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing that will, sort of go extra. Other things I keep very strictly to thoughtbot time. Or if there are things I'm doing for a client, then they stays very strictly within the client time.
How do you think the role would be different in a product company?
So I think there's more expressions of the role within a product company. There's a website that we'll link in the show notes. It's staffeng.com. It talks a little bit about what this role is like. And there's a particular article on there titled, What Do Staff Engineers Actually Do? That I find is really fascinating because it really gets at this sort of multi-dimensional aspect of the role. So I'll read off sort of just the headings from here that are really interesting. And then we can dig into any of those if those are particularly interesting to you. But one of them is setting technical direction.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is mentorship and sponsorship. Third one is providing an engineering perspective to decision makers. Fourth one is exploration. And then finally, being glue, which is sort of all those extra things that help to catalyze a technical team.
It seems like many of those are extra relevant in a moment when AI is having such a huge impact on our field, as far as, technical direction and engineering perspective and things like that, a CEO might want to have a principal engineer in the room when they're deciding now everybody must use AI, or we're going to have a token leaderboard or something like that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, if you want a technical expert in the room, right, that is absolutely something that you're going to want, especially at a larger organization, and especially at an organization where maybe senior leadership within the company doesn't have as much hands-on connection with some of these things. That does mean that your principal engineer who's going to show up in the room needs to know what they're talking about, though. That means keeping up with a lot of these things. And some of this can be delegated, but part of the role is you have to sort of stay sharp and be able to speak to changes in technology, be able to think about ways that it can adapt. And so I think what you're getting at is the engineering perspective side of things. But another thing that was mentioned in that article is the idea of exploration. Mm-hmm. And so getting a sense of what's possible, having a little bit of creativity of like, here's different ways that we could maybe leverage a potential technology, or knowing what the pitfalls are, even if you don't necessarily go all the way super deep, to be able to have then that conversation with senior management. But then also maybe with the engineering team when they're setting their sort of goals for growth, or you're sort of setting, here's where we need to be as a team. That's going to matter a lot as well.
Yeah, makes sense. What advice or just like questions to reflect on would you have for someone who is considering whether or not that's a role they'd be interested in or a path they want to pursue?
One of the things that can be a little bit challenging, especially at a place like thoughtbot, right, where senior developer is a totally fine place to stop your career progression, or at least sort of title progression. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not like you're going to be like, oh, you haven't moved on in like 2 years, you're on the list to get cut or something like that.
Right.
Which is the case at some companies. So when you start moving up towards that principal role, you start having more responsibilities, more things you have to work on, and that might be more than you want. And what can happen a little bit in that transition that's really challenging is that as you're moving towards principal, you start really exceeding expectations for your current role. and you were just knocking it out of the park. And then once you hit that promotion, all of a sudden those things become baseline.
Yeah. You're no longer exceeding expectations.
Because that role was meant to give a label to what exceeding all those expectations were.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe you want to say, all right, that's my new baseline. I'm just going to sit there. Or maybe you want to start pushing to see, can I start exceeding expectations again? That can feel like a lot of pressure, and that transition can be really challenging. So that's definitely something I would tell someone who's looking to go that direction to be aware of, in terms of how they navigate that emotionally, but then also just in terms of what maybe the pressure and the workload feels like. So are you comfortable doing what you're doing now? If you started exceeding expectations and you were feeling really good about yourself and then that became baseline, would that be something that feels disappointing to you? More broadly, thinking in terms of impact, what are the things that are really meaningful for you? Do you like just having impact by shipping stories and just being really good at that? Or do you want to start having impact that has a broader range? And if so, what are the opportunities you see right now on your team where you can have some of that impact, maybe not as big as you would like to in the future, but right now that you find are meaningful?
Those are really thought-provoking things to think about. I feel like stuff in my brain is like, maybe when the kids leave for college. Maybe I will have room in my brain to sort of pursue some of that when the kids leave for college. But maybe I won't, and that's fine. And maybe I like being a senior engineer, and maybe that's just where I'll stay. We'll see.
And you've had a variety of roles within thoughtbot, right? Because you've been a team lead at one point.
I was a team lead at one point. So yeah, I did explore going down sort of, I think we think about it a lot as sort of like a fork in the road. When you get to a certain point, you're either going to go down the management higher level track or the IC higher level track. So I tested the waters with the management track. I was a team lead for about a year and realized that it just wasn't the right fit for me. I felt it was a combination of I wasn't sure that I was doing a very good job of it, but also I think it stressed me out more than it needed to. And finally I just realized this form of working with other people is not what I like. I love working with other people and I love mentoring and teaching and being taught and mentored. But the formal HR reportable relationship just felt very not how I like to work. And so thankfully, thoughtbot is the kind of place that lets you try something and then change your mind. So it wasn't well, you're in management now, good luck. I was able to sort of gracefully step away from the team lead and go back to staff or senior developer. Yeah, and it's been interesting. And so I'm definitely at a place now where it's okay, I've been with thoughtbot for 7 years at this point recently. I've tried the team lead thing. Management isn't for me. And I've thought about principal engineer. I think I'm not super interested in that yet either, because it just seems like a level of focus that I don't have the resources for in my brain and life right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken me a while, but I'm okay with that. I am not a principal developer and I'm not focusing on being a principal developer, but I can still do interesting things at work and outside of work.
Absolutely.
Turns out they let you on a podcast even if you aren't. Don't tell anyone. And it's been fun to sort of just explore if I did want to focus deeply on something, what would that be? And sort of hopping around and trying different stuff and seeing what catches me, what feels like it gives me a new level of purpose in this work.
Yeah. And you might find throughout that maybe you find yourself drifting towards situations that are sort of broader leverage. And then maybe that sort of, you start drifting towards more of a principal direction. If you find that you do more of these things and they're meaningful, maybe you start putting more conscious energy towards that. And then it becomes an actual path that you're looking forward.
Yeah. So it's interesting to have gotten to a point in my career where it's there's not an obvious next step, and I sort of get to think about it and explore, or just stay comfortable where I am and not have an official formal next step.
That can be a very uncomfortable place.
Yeah, sometimes it is uncomfortable, but sometimes it's also really freeing. Like, I know that I'm doing a good job at my, senior developer duties, and I've become comfortable enough with them that it's, I wouldn't say easy, but it's like, it's a well-worn path, When I stumble into a dark corner, chances are I've been in this dark corner before and I know where the light switch is.
Right.
And the things that I do outside of that, it's like, because there's not the pressure to like, you need to make it to this next level before you hit this many years or you're out of here. Right. And because it's widely acknowledged within thoughtbot that principal is not for everybody and not something that everybody's going to be interested in pursuing, it doesn't feel like there's pressure to like, oh my God, I have to figure out what my principal focus is going to be. Instead, It can be like, oh, I think I want to explore maintaining an open source project for a while. And then, if that gets to a point where it's wrapped up and I'm not really excited about it anymore, or hand it off to somebody else, or AI makes it completely obsolete or something, then it's kind of like, okay, well, what's next? What else do I get to think about now? Which isn't to say that you don't have that freedom as a principal, but it feels a little bit more playful in the senior role.
There's definitely, in terms of what I sort of try to go deep on, there is a mix of interest and strategy.
Yeah.
Right now some of that aligns because a lot of the stuff I'm exploring on the AI side of things, there's some personal interest there, but then also there's a lot of questions that our organization has, that our clients have. And so being able to be that person in the room who has the answers to say, I played around with this thing, here's the results I've gotten so far. Or I keep up with these aspects of the industry, and here's sort of roughly the 3 buckets that strategies have fallen into that people are using this tool in the past 6 months, is a valuable thing to provide.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
You mentioned earlier that more at the beginning of your career, you had a really positive interaction at a place that had a principal engineer. What are some maybe aspects of this particular person's expression of the role that stood out to you?
I think they were good at sort of, like, if we had a tricky piece of work we were doing, and maybe they're not involved in actually writing the code for it, but like pulling them into a conversation and saying like, hey, I'm struggling with this. There are a few different approaches and I'm not really sure what to think. I felt like they were always really helpful for like, okay, well, here's something that maybe another team is doing that I've been involved in that you don't know about that might reflect on that. So a little bit of the glue there. Like, here's, different teams are working on different things and here's how they might interact. And here's someone that you could talk to about that. Or sort of like a broader perspective, or sometimes just like super deep knowledge on something I just didn't know about. And this person never approached it as a like, okay, I will deign to offer you some of my golden nuggets of principal knowledge. And it was more like, hey, I'm here. I have some resources and some skills and some knowledge. What can I do to help you? And that sort of aligns with all of my beliefs about leadership, is that it's less about authority and prestige and more about like support and service to the rest of your team. And so, yeah, the principal that I can remember that I really got a lot out of working with was really good at that, was really approachable and helpful and knowledgeable. And also did a lot of like the sort of teaching perspective that everybody hates in high school, where it's like, I ask you a question and then you ask me a question back to guide me there. But is less annoying in this context, I think.
The sort of Socratic approach. The website I referenced earlier that had that article about different aspects of the job also offers 4 archetypes that most staff plus roles fall into that I find really fascinating. I do love, turning things into a taxonomy. So the 4 archetypes are the tech lead, which is not a management position, unlike the team lead position at thoughtbot, but is someone who's really sort of connecting with the team to try to execute a particular technical strategy. There's an architect, who's a little bit more around some of that earlier conversation we had of sort of balancing strategy with the technical needs and trying to like bridge that, but in more of a planning sort of role.
Mm-hmm.
You have a solver who is often someone who's got deep expertise and can sort of have any type of problem thrown at them. And so when there's sort of a hot spot in the company, a problem that needs to be solved, that needs sort of focused, specialized attention, you can just throw them at it. And then finally, there is a right hand who's sort of a bridge between leadership and various technical teams. And all of those are not necessarily always embedded within a single team. They can sort of float around a broader organization and sort of be sent to deal with a particular issue, or like you're saying, make themselves available as a resource to a particular team because they have context on a problem. They can work with a particular team to maybe set technical direction on where the team wants to grow. They might be a broader bridge between, let's say, the executive team and a variety of engineering teams. So it kind of varies a lot throughout. But the breakdown into archetypes I found was a really interesting way to put that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I imagine that one person could also probably move between those archetypes throughout a career.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd imagine that most principal developers have a little bit of all of those in them.
Mm-hmm.
I know that when we were initially creating the principal developer role at thoughtbot, one of the things that we wanted to be part of that role was the idea that you have the sort of breadth of experience and knowledge that we can throw you at just about any project that comes our way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when we've got projects and we have to staff them, we have to find like a person who's a good fit for it. And sometimes there are more challenging projects that come in that just have a particular shape that's not good for most people. And part of what we wanted with the principal developers is say we have one or two people in our back pocket who we feel comfortable throwing on just about any project, and that can help balance out those, especially when something unexpected comes up.
Yeah. Yeah, there are definitely projects I've seen where it's like it will take a special soul to make this work out.
One thing that's interesting at thoughtbot, I think, in that vein is that we have often historically thought of our different roles based off of how they can be staffed.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, the distinguishing mark between developer and senior developer was, do you have the skills where we feel confident staffing you solo on a client? Whereas people who just had the developer title, typically we would want them to always be on a project where they had one other thoughtbotter. So there's just a little bit more support going on.
Yeah, and when we've had apprentices in the past, the difference between an apprentice and a developer is that a developer is expected to be someone who can be billed for on a project, whereas an apprentice is generally not charging for their time because they're not at the level where they're really contributing that way yet.
Right. They're there to learn, and we don't want them to have the pressure of having to generate enough value to justify billable time. And so clients like it because it's effectively free labor, but it's maybe not as much as a thoughtbot developer would be. They're paired with a mentor. So they have much tighter support. And that will pull a little bit of the mentor's focus. So I don't know, maybe the mentor is 90 or 95% as effective as they would be without an apprentice. But if an apprentice is, 30% effective or 50% effective, and their time's not paid for, the clients come out on top. It's a good deal.
Yeah. Which of those archetypes do you identify with the most these days?
Ooh. I'd probably say a little bit of the tech lead, a little bit of the right hand, because a lot of what I've tried to do is lean into more of the enablement side of things. So try to lift up our team technically as much as possible. while also trying to align to the sort of strategic vision that the management team has. And so I think that it's sort of, I'm pulling from both of those archetypes in the way that I probably most often express the role.
That makes sense. And that sort of aligns with how I see your work too. So I probably would have guessed the same thing. Well, shall we wrap up?
I think this is a good place to wrap up.